It's 20 to 7 now on Drive. The cult leader Charles Manson has died in prison in California at the age of 83 after over 4 decades spent behind bars for orchestrating a series of brutal murders in the late 1960s. Manson became synonymous with the dark side of counterculture around that time, believing that the murders would start a race war and allow him to seize power. His followers were called the Manson family. They killed 9 people altogether under his direction, including the heavily pregnant Hollywood actress Sharon Tate, the wife at that time of the film director Roman Polanski. Now, Manson wasn't actually at the scene during any of the killings, but he was convicted for 7 counts of murder. Here he is in court in 1971.
I don't accept the court. I don't accept the whole situation. You know, like I was in the desert minding my business. This confusion belongs to you. It's your confusion. I don't have any confusion. I don't have any guilt. I know what I've done, and no man can judge me. I judge me.
What have you done, Charlie?
Well, Manson was sentenced to death in 1970. This was later commuted to life imprisonment. He gave several television interviews while he was in jail. Here he is speaking to Tom Snyder on NBC.
Sometimes I feel I'm scared to live. Living is what scares me. Dying is easy.
Well, for the rest of the programme, we'll be exploring who Charles Manson and his followers were, the crimes they committed, and the almost cult-like status that the group has gained since. And just to give you a little warning now ahead of that, especially if you're listening with children, there inevitably may be some disturbing and graphic details to this story.
And do share your thoughts with us as well as we go along. 85058 on the text or at BBC5 Live on social media. Joining us then are Jeff Guinn, an author who wrote the best-selling book Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson. Hello, Jeff.
Hi.
Nick Godwin is the executive producer of Manson, which is a feature-length drama documentary about the man. Hello, Nick.
Hi there.
Nikolas Schreck is with us as well, a musician, author and filmmaker, a close friend of Charles Manson since 1985. He wrote the book, The Manson Files, and produced the documentary Charles Manson Superstar. Hello to you, Nikolas.
Hi there, how are you tonight?
Very well, thank you. Jeff, we'll start with you because I'm conscious that there's a whole generation, really, a younger generation who might recognise the name but know very little about the story of Charles Manson. So take us back, and how did he get from a career petty criminal, I suppose, to somebody who was one of the most evil men of his age?
Well, Manson was always the wrong man in the right place at the right time. When he was paroled from prison in 1967, he was paroled in California and first made his way to the San Francisco area, Haight-Ashbury in the Summer of Love, where so many young people, young Americans who were estranged from their families and wanted someone to tell them how to live, where to go. A guru was the term at the time. And some of them encountered Manson there. His philosophy was cobbled together from the Bible, Beatles lyrics, and the great and well-known How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is, of course, the book that was written and was a huge bestseller. There wasn't a lot original about him, but what he found was an original place to try to attract followers. From there, they migrated down to Los Angeles. That was where the nexus of the recording industry was located in America at that time. It moved from Los Angeles. He happened to be there at a time in American history where the kinds of acts he and his followers got involved in became notorious.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, to pick up on that, how did he take a place and a time that, as Jeff was saying there, was so synonymous with love and turn it into something that was so deeply filled with hate?
Well, I think Manson wasn't the only one at the time who was acting as a sort of Pied Piper, if you like. There were a lot of kids out there, sort of late teens, early 20s, who were looking for something. I think Manson, in the end, of course, was by far the most sinister, but there were a whole proliferation of weird, abusive cults were springing up at the time. I think Manson, though, took it a whole stage further. I mean, people say he was a very compelling character. He was Vincent Bugliosi, who was the prosecutor, says that, you know, although Manson was completely uneducated, he was extremely intelligent and he was extremely manipulative. So he was able to take if you like, the sort of insecurities and the desires of these kids to find something new, who after all, most of whom had run away from home or left home, and manipulated them using all that intelligence, but also all that prison cunning. He'd been in prison half his life, I think, by the time he was let out.
What was it, Nick? Because I know that was a lot of what you were interested in, how people and who kind of fell under his spell. What was it that drew you to his story in the first place?
Well, the Manson story's been told many times, and we made this film 7 or 8 years ago, but at the time it had still been told many, many times. So we wanted a new angle on it, if you like, and we tell the story very much through a character called Linda Kasabian, who was one of the members of a family. She in effect was the getaway driver on the night of the Sharon Tate killings, and she ended up turning state's evidence. After that, she went into hiding and I think she hadn't spoken for 20-odd years. I mean, it took us 6 months to find her and persuade her to take part. But so, if you like, our way of trying to understand Manson was very much through her story. And, you know, she joined the family a month before the killings. She thought it was great at first. She was a 20-year-old single mum who was looking for something new. A friend suggested going up to the ranch where they all were, and she said it was great at first. It was, you know, sex, drugs and rock and roll, and they were sort of step by step drawn further and further away from the norm. But it happened pretty rapidly, the real turn to the dark side.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at it, Jeff, and when we kind of pull it apart and look at all of the different layers, I suppose, what is it about the Charles Manson story that means that even now we're still talking about him and the members of the family and the crimes that he and they committed? Why do you think it's lived in the psyche for so long?
Well, it began, of course, in 1969. It was a time when it seemed like the whole world was coming apart, and particularly in America. There was great racial strife, great divisions over the war in Vietnam. And the Manson killing not only was horrific in and of itself, but it happened in Los Angeles, which is sort of the center of the entertainment industry. It involved an actress who was relatively famous, and of course her husband, Roman Polanski, much more so. And to a certain extent, after Manson's arrest, as the long, weird trial extends, it passed from just being sort of a crime story into almost entertainment, painful to watch, but you couldn't look away. You can almost think of Manson then as the equivalent, let's say, of a criminal Kardashian, that people just wanted to kind of watch and see what crazy thing would happen next. If Manson had been executed as scheduled, I think he generally would have been forgotten then within a generation. The problem being his sentence was commuted to life, and every few years he would do something else crazy or weird. That would keep him in the public eye, plus Vince Bugliosi's Helter Skelter. 9 million copies sold. So Manson actually became part of the culture as well as someone who was caught up in the criminal justice system.
May I be allowed to offer an alternative?
Sorry, Nikolas, is that you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to introduce you, Nikolas. So this is, we said hello at the start. Nikolas Schreck, a musician, author, filmmaker, and friend of Manson since 1985. Nikolas, go on. What would you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, with all due respect, the opinions that you said in your introduction, what Mr. Guinn has said, what Nick has said, this is mainstream media's view of what occurred. My research, and I'm the only person here who knew Manson very well and have spoken to people on both sides of the equation, people involved with the Manson commune, Manson himself, people who were friends with Roman Polanski. None of what you have said is essentially true. I will just say 2 points to begin with, and then you can ask what you like. Linda Kasabian was a well-known drug dealer before she met Manson. She was a professional drug dealer. The way she joined the commune, which was never called the family until the media called it that, was that she stole $5,000 from her husband at the behest of Charles Tex Watson, who was also a drug dealer. Linda Kasabian and Tex Watson were drug dealers in the underworld, and they largely devised and had the motive for the crimes that we remember as the Tate LaBianca murders. Linda Kasabian, according to my research, is one of the guiltiest of the people who were involved. However, Vincent Bugliosi, whose book Helter Skelter is, by any serious researcher, not something that is credible, because he was basically creating a prosecution case. He was not telling the truth. The final thing, Linda Kasabian is free today. As far as my research shows, she was central to planning the crime. She was a drug dealer who was trying to get back at Jay Sebring and Wojtek Frykowski, who she bought drugs from, with her lover, Tex Watson.
Okay,
so that's the first thing I wanted to say. Then you can refute it.
Yeah. Well, I just want to talk more about Manson himself, Nikolas, in the sense that it is indisputable that these people were murdered. So what we're questioning here, or what you're trying to question, is the level of Manson's responsibility. It's as simple as that.
I believe he was an accessory to these murders. He is a criminal. He lived by the underworld code. He knew about the murder of Sharon Tate and the others after it happened, and he didn't call the police because he's a criminal. He went back and helped them get rid of evidence. That's true. He was an accessory to these murders. The idea that this group of petty criminals and hippies was some kind of religious cult is nonsense.
Okay.
Furthermore, the main point here, he was not the mastermind of these murders. He was scapegoated and allowed to become this figure of incarnate evil.
Okay, all right. Let's get the counterpoint there. Then Jeff Guinn and Nick Godwin listening in. Guys, you've heard what Nikolas has had to say. In essence, Charles Manson has been demonised along the way. Jeff, do you want to start the response there?
I think the basic response is that Manson used to claim he was the man of 1,000 hats, that he could appear to be anything he wanted to be. He can be very persuasive. I think what we've just heard is completely wrong, just as the person who was saying it thinks I'm wrong. I have my research, he has his. We've both put those forward in books and in film, and I think people can judge for themselves.
Nick Godwin?
Well, I think it's utter nonsense, really. I mean, you know, the prosecution case was tested out at trial, and a jury found Manson and the family guilty. So unless there is hard evidence to the counter, I think it's utter nonsense. But I think it also goes...
Well, I wrote 1,000...
Okay, but I think it also goes... I think it also goes to show the hold Manson has over people. He does have a sort of glamour and a hold over people, and has done ever since the prosecution. One of the things that happened in California, it was very interesting. You know, in California, they changed the law about filming people in prison, because every time a news crew went in and Charles Manson was interviewed, he's a really, really compelling character and crazy as can be. But just to get round the problem, they stopped all filming in California prisons for a long, long time.
Let's return, if we can, Jeff and Nick, to the transformation of this guy. Let's talk about his classification mentally from the start, because was there a point he kind of had influences within the music scene, didn't he? In LA, he got to know one of the Beach Boys, and he had pretensions at making his own music, didn't he? So at that point, do you think he was truly murderous, or was there some level of transformation? Was it drugs that changed Charles Manson?
Well, you know, I was able to find people that knew Charles Manson from childhood. Found his first cousin Joanne, he lived with her, and his uncle and aunt when his mother was incarcerated. I found his adopted sister, who had never talked before. Manson, from the time he was young, was a thoroughly disagreeable, violent person. He knew how to present himself in certain ways, sometimes good, sometimes evil. One other thing just to touch on real quickly, we talk about, the media invented the family. at least that name the family. That's not true. If you talk to Greg Jacobson, a close friend of Dennis Wilson and somebody who ran with him in Manson for a while, Greg will tell you that the origin of the name family came out of that time, and it was something that they said about Manson and his followers. So everybody can look into things, and you can always find somebody who's known Charles Manson or even talked to Manson, and you'll hear one version or another, and it might change from day to day. People died. They died for no good reason, and Manson ever since has tried to keep himself in the public view. That's something he always enjoyed, and he knows how to play people very well. So no, there was no egregious sudden change, and he was always a pretty despicable human being.
Let's bring Nikolas Schreck back in. Nikolas, let's put to one side the disagreement over what particularly happened and who was responsible. Let's just talk about Charles Manson for a moment, because you knew him from '85 onwards. What was he like as a person? What did you discover about Charles Manson?
I would say the main thing quickly that general audience could understand is he performed a character called Charles Manson at the court, at the trial, and in media interviews. Very much to his own detriment, he played a part. He was cast as the villain and the bogeyman, and he played that part. The private person that I knew and that other people knew had elements of that Charles Manson that the public's familiar with, but I also saw the human being behind all that. He was not this sinister, evil figure of absolute dread that the media has presented for years. He was absolutely a criminal. He was a pimp. He was a drug dealer. He was not a mass murderer. And I'm not at all saying he's innocent of crimes. I'm saying the crimes have been presented wrongly. And in my book, The Manson File, I present 1,000 pages of information about what kind of person he was and what he did. But the other thing, as far as his keeping a spell over people, this was the excuse that these people used. They had the responsibility for what they did.
Okay,
they
all right.
had the motive.
Yes. Yeah, I understand that, Nick. I'm sorry, I'm not closing you down, but we've only got a couple of minutes left. And Nick Godwin, I just want to move on to the general view, because quite a few people, well, I say a small handful of people have texted the programme saying, why are you talking about Charles Manson? But I just want to reflect on the effect this had on society in America at the time when all these crimes happened. I mean, did you get any sense of that when you were making your documentary?
I think as both the guests have touched on, what was so compelling about Manson is he also, if you like, signalled the confluence of music. I mean, music in a way that could never happen today. He was hanging out with the Beach Boys. He was trying to persuade Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son, a big record producer at the time, to produce his own music. As well as the sex, the drugs, the cult side. I think after that, I mean, the immediate thing that happened is there was absolute terror in LA. We heard stories of the sale of guns tripling, people buying fencing. I think it was a much more innocent time.
Well, it was kind of a flip. It was kind of a flip side.
60s.
Yeah, it was a flip side, wasn't it, to kind of the hippie utopia that many Americans thought could legitimately exist in the 1960s.
There was, but there was a crossover. It would be hard to imagine today, if you like, between the superstars and this ragtag bunch of hippies led by Manson. It's hard to imagine, a superstar band hanging out with people like that today. But the barriers were much lower back in the 60s.
Jeff Guinn, final word to you. We've got a minute or so left. What's your assessment of how Manson behaved in prison? We talked earlier. His death sentence was commuted. So you often hear from people in that position where they say, well, that actually being in prison was worse. Do you get the sense by playing up to his notoriety that he kind of enjoyed the role of playing Charles Manson, as Nikolas Schreck said?
He certainly did. Leslie Van Houten told me that just before the members of the Manson followers, Manson himself, were captured in Death Valley, Manson told them that if he was ever arrested again, he was going to play Crazy Charlie. and would do that until everyone in the law decided he was so insane he couldn't be held responsible for anything, and they would let him go. He's played Manson successfully right up to the day of his death, and in that you can call the man a success.
Jeff, we must leave it there. Jeff Guinn, Nick Godwin and Nikolas Schreck, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts, your texts, your tweets. We'll see you tomorrow. It's time for Sport Now. Here's Chappers.